I'm with the Lincoln Underground Storage Tank Program, and the name's Henry Haven. I'm the geologist for the Lincoln Underground Storage Tank Program, and then Pam Maples. I work with Pam on a lot of sites. So we do a lot of groundwater, soil remediation work, and so we started this program back in actually 2004, when we finally had some funds available. Navajo Nation had funds available, and so we actually started in 2004. But prior to 2004, even back to 1999, we were still trying to set up the program. So we only had one staff, myself, for the whole program. So at that time, we were trying to figure out, what our universe was, how many tanks are out there, how many leaking sites, how many contaminated sites. So that was our job beginning in 1999. So, but 2004 is when we actually had the program beginning with funding from the tariff fees that we received from all gasoline sales on Navajo Nation. So, just to show a picture, these are sites that we looked at. This is the old Cross Canyon trading post. It's no longer there. It's kind of been flattened out and everything's gone. So, but these are sites that we began with. We started addressing abandoned sites where we don't have any responsible parties, but these were sites that were just sitting out there, and so, but at the same time, they also had, these dispensers out there, and underground storage tanks that were just left behind. So, but we began with some of these sites in the beginning. So, and the other thing that we did from the beginning for the program was to try to identify sites on Navajo Nation where all the gas stations were at, abandoned sites. And so the red dots up here were definitely, we had confirmation that there's groundwater contamination, petroleum groundwater contamination, and soil contamination. So you can see like Shiprock, Window Rock, and Tuba cities were the communities that were mostly impacted by oil releases. So, but other sites, the green you can't really see too well, but these were all the abandoned sites. The green dots, those are abandoned tank sites. So we went and actually started from working from the abandoned sites, and then on up to tank removals. So 2004, like I said, we actually started the program addressing these sites. So we do have a Navajo Nation UST Act of 1998. It was approved, but it didn't have the funding to start this program. So back in 1998, I started trying to gather information, try to write up the fund management plan. So that was all completed starting in 1998. So we're starting to program, but in 2004 we had $1.3 million that was kind of that accumulated up to 2004. So we finally had the fund management plan in place. Now we started addressing all of these sites. So at that time, President Shirley was the person that signed the first contract. So initially, there were 69 sites that we identified, and so the trust fund, this is Navajo Nation's UST trust fund that we finally started using in 2004. And some of the sites that we looked at, we know that the Lincoln sites, we know definitely that was a site that definitely had contamination issues. Working sites, meaning these are present oil and gas stations throughout the nations. Those are working sites. So the other sites, abandoned sites, like I said, 26%. It's, you know, just gas stations, no operators, but everything was still there. So that was the area that we concentrated on. At the same time, there's present operators that are also dealing with gasoline releases, so all these things are ongoing. Questionable areas, I believe that now we're kind of like addressing those sites now, because we do a lot of geophysical surveys to make sure that we have all the tanks have been identified, and so that's where we're at right now. I think in this area we're pretty much done with addressing all the abandoned sites. You know, one or two might pop up, and which we miss. So that's currently where we're at, and some of the things that we've done. Let's see, Pam, see how that shows up.
Yeah,
So what we typically do is we go to a location, try to figure out how many tanks there are, if there are any water wells in the immediate area. So that's one of our concerns, is that we need to do all this work out in the field, and then we start actually starting putting our work plans together, and we get all these reports at the end. So we do a lot of drilling, and we do a lot of monitoring well completions, meaning they're not deep wells, they're just shallow, about 30 feet. And that monitoring it consists of water lab samples that we collect, or soil samples that we take out just to assess how bad the site is, or how severe, if it's impacting any water wells in that area. So, and then the final end of the whole thing is we go back now, we come up with some plan, corrective action plan, where we're actually addressing the groundwater impacts, if there's soil impacts. And so this is old, the Pine Springs Trading Post. You can see that this was the Spencer Island, and this is pretty much the area where we would investigate and say, try to find that tank. We don't know where it was at, but we found the tanks over here rather than underneath the dispensers. So this is one area that we have addressed in 2004. So some of the issues that we have with these sites, one of the things that kind of jumps out at us, and this was kind of a summary of one of the issues, the problems that we have when we do work out there. So I'm just going to go here. I think numbers are messed up here. I think one of the things that we've when I said abandoned sites, that was the first area that we kind of addressed, but there's some sites that are still, we're trying to remediate. And for instance, former Davis Chevrolet in Tuba City, that's an old release. We're still working on it, but the issue there is groundwater. It had soil contamination issues, it has groundwater contaminations, but you know that groundwater doesn't stay, it's not stable, it kind of moves with you know, the gradient. So what happened at Davis Chevrolet is that the contamination hit the groundwater, then it started migrating south across the highway, went underneath the highway, and went on to Hopi land. So we were kind of like on the north tip of that plume, and the rest of that plume is sitting on that Hopi. So that's one of the things we have to sit down with Hopi and say, look, you know, I know the release occurred on Navajo, now we're having to address it on Hopi. So I think those are one of the issues that we have when we have impacted our neighbors. So we're still trying to work with that. We do have other sites like Bon and Bon and Shiprock we're still addressing. So some of these sites, we're talking like releases that occurred back in 70s or even 60s, you know. So those are sites that we're looking at. Sweetwater Trading Post, we're still looking at that. We're still monitoring that. Chief Conoco and Shiprock. We removed a lot of soil. There was a lot of contamination there, right at that former Chief Conoco? Yeah, right across from the current Thriftway station. The problem there was there's two stations across from each other, and we thought at times that we had a lot of commingling and the groundwater contamination. So we're trying to clean up one site across the street, but the contamination is still there. So, and we were downgrading it. So that was one of the issues that we had with Thriftway. We're, you know, kind of working with them together. But what we did there at Conoco was that we thought that the best way to address a lot of these sites was to go at the source, which is soil. You know, the soil contamination. And if anything, if you got water movement down from the surface into the ground, it's going to carry a lot of that contamination, petroleum contamination, right into groundwater. Then it starts to migrate, it starts to move. So at this site, we went in there probably, I don't know, 4 years ago, and we removed all the petroleum contaminated soil at the surface, from surface to down to about 15 feet. We start removing all of that, and within a year, I would say within a year, we started seeing results from the sampling program. So the contamination, groundwater contamination issues there has dropped like 90%. So we're still dealing with, like, you know, now 5% you can still see, but it was kind of like just a dot. It wasn't a big area anymore. It's like, you know, probably 5 by 5 foot area that we're looking at that we still had, you know, a little bit of issues. So we went back and we were ready to issue a no further action on it, and I noticed that there was a playground already built on it. You know, we went back and saw that they've cleaned up the surface and put playgrounds on top of it. So we didn't have really any issues with that. We already dug up the whole place and put new soil, but I think we're kind of like proud of that, because it seems to be like we got that land back to surface use for anybody that wants to go back in. The other one is White Eagle. Now that's kind of the same situation as Conoco. We removed a lot of soil. We demoed the building. It was right at the intersection where you go north to Cortez, and right when you cross the bridge, the old White Eagle sitting there at the corner. So we're working with the business development people, economic development, to try and put these areas back into use. So Chief Conoco, White Eagle's about nearly where we can, you know, release some of those that property back to Navajo Nation. Anyway, so that's kind of like the present day. But the other issue we have is with Pick and Run. Pick and Run has a in Chinle has a current owner, and there was a release that occurred back in 2005 at that site. They were installing, they were pulling out the old underground storage tanks, and they were putting in above ground storage tanks. They're huge tanks. I mean, they're like 2 10,000 gallon tanks sitting right at the surface. what happened was when they were still installing, but they were these tanks, but there were product lines that were running to the dispensers, so they were in operation. They were drilling in that area, and they drilled right through the product line, and it released 10,000 gallons of gasoline into the groundwater. Now this is a current owner that's operating out there. So the issue that came out of that is that they exhausted the insurance money that was, you know, what the current operator had was $1 million. That's the coverage that they normally carry. They would and exceeded that amount, just trying to figure out who was responsible. So there were a lot of people that came to the table, and a lot of attorneys were involved. We had this gathering that we couldn't solve who the responsible party was. So now, today, that same issue's in court, in Navajo Nation courts in Chinle. So right now, the site doesn't have any funds. We did approach US EPA last year, and our concern was that we need to address these sites when it occurs, not 10 years later. 10 years later, we're still fighting over who's responsible, and it's not good. I think that's where we really need the attorneys to get involved, become more aggressive, and start trying to figure out who the responsible parties are. Right now, a lot of insurance companies, I think there are 4 or 5 insurance companies involved in the site. They don't come to the table, but you know, we're trying hard to have them commit some of their funds to clean up. So we're stuck. We're stuck with that bill. We're stuck with US EPA barely giving us like $100,000. But with this money they give us, we need to monitor that too. We got in trouble this year for not keeping track of how much money was spent. You know, we're kind of getting to those problems with when we try to address sites immediately. Then they say, well, the condition is going to be this. And you know, how we get into some accounting situations and things like that. So that's one where, that's another issue that we have. A lot of sites don't have valid business site leases. The example I'm giving here is 2 Gray Hills near Senasti. We went out there and we found abandoned sites. There are tanks still there, and we asked the operator, you know, why are you leaving these tanks in the ground? Because our act in 1998 says you got to pull these tanks out, and we got to assess the site, make sure that there's no releases. And the guy told us that I don't have a lease. Navajo Nation didn't give me a business site lease, so it's not my problem. So those are things where I think we really need some backup from the legal department to go after some of these people. Why are they still operating out there? We talked to economic development. We don't get any answers. So I think that's an issue that we have. We removed the tanks. We used our money to remove the tanks. And the idea behind that is that if we don't do anything and let this go on, then we're not really doing, I think we're not doing our job to make these sites safe, to go after cleanup, you know, soil and groundwater. So that's why we went and removed those tanks. But fortunately, we didn't find any real issues with that site. The other one that's happening right now, the issue that we have, way back, Turfway had a lot of stores on Navajo Nation. Turfway stores that some of those at that time, I'm thinking, I forget, 1980s. Around that time, and at that time I think there were some issues where people got paid to get leases again. And Turfway was told they were kind of kicked off the reservation, and some of those sites, like 5 sites, were given to Navajo people that could take over the business. A lot of those sites now has been given to Giant also. Giant is now, we negotiated an agreement where we told them that these are issues that started way back, 1980s, and that's like what, 30 years later, we're still trying to get people to clean up. What is wrong with this whole thing? You know, I can't see where business leases are being given out, and people that operate on Navajo Nation, they tend to bribe people, and that's what happened. Was they kicked Turfway out, but they come back. It's the same people operating under a different name, Red Mesa Express. There are employees that now operate those sites. We did address some of those sites on our own, but we went back to Turfway and said, you know, these things that you guys had abandoned, we had to address it. We went and sat with them, and they did reimburse us for the work that we did. So, but the other thing, all those other sites that I have listed here, Giant, we finally got Giant to the table. Our rules and regulations, we cannot tell an operator to go and do a site assessment when they're saying all the tank tests, tank tightness tests that they do, line testing, they say, oh, the tank is fine, there's no leaks. But the problem, the whole thing is you cannot really detect small leaks, a drop, with the current detection systems on these tanks. And if you have 30 or 40 years of this drop, this thing gets into the groundwater. Well, we can't detect those things. So we went back and said, you know, economic development contacted us, said, you know, we're redoing a business lease because all of these leases expired. So okay, now's the time to see if we can sit down with economic development and tell them that if you want to renew these leases, we want a phase 2 site assessment, which is drilling, and, you know, drill down 30 feet, take some soil samples, see if there's any releases. There were almost all the sites had releases, except maybe 2 that was severe, where we told them you need to go back and do some more drilling. This is St. Michael's over here, and can't remember, Pam, do you remember the other one?
Burnside?
Huh?
Is it Burnside?
Burnside. So those 2 sites, they're going to go back in, drill additional wells, and maybe try to figure out what we need to do there. So we had an opportunity to go back and tell these people, after 40 years, you know, do something. So I think that's a big problem. That's a big issue that we have. So anyway, we finally got them to drill. There's another well, Kisna's Eye. They cleaned up the site, but Turfway left. They've done their job. to clean up the site. Giant didn't want the site. There was a water well there that they've used to run the station. It was right near where the contamination occurred. Well, we felt like that well kind of serves maybe, several families in that area. We said, can you move that water well away from the site? So that's where we're at right now. They haven't moved the water well, but we've kind of went round and round with everybody on the site, but we're trying to keep the family happy, but it's going to take some time, but it's coming to a close. I think these Navajo-owned business also is another area where they cannot address these sites with issues like contamination issues. And it costs us sometimes over $1 million to try to address these sites. But there's leases out there that still have issues with Navajo business owners. Okay. So the concerns, all of this thing all put together, companies are not always cooperative when they come to the table to clean up sites. And sometimes we're the one responsible for cleanup on these sites. And then we don't have any immediate actions from US EPA, and yet, but they're the oversight. US EPA kind of says, you got to get these blah, 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 but you got to go after people, you got to, clean up. Now, nation's responsible. Same time, there's no funding from them. Sometimes they give us some money, but it kind of falls short on trying to cover all the issues. So the other thing is, like I said, if we were to go in there and start finding out who's responsible, that would never end. It would keep debating who's responsible. So that's another thing that we need to probably get together and say, the first thing that we need to do is just go after that contamination, try to deal with it. And then the natural attenuation is another area that we had issues with from the very beginning. People say that natural attenuation is a method for cleanup, which is just to look at it, monitor it, and let it, hope it goes away. So in our act, the cleanup standards, we said, no, that would be the last option we would consider. Because 30 years later, 40 years later, still like that. Again, we have rules and regulations, EPA and Navajo Nation EPA, like I said, for requirements for cleanup, things like that. This is former White Eagle. We removed the tanks. This is probably down 7 feet. The San Juan River is right there in that area. So the groundwater is very shallow, 7 feet. So we removed the tanks, but this was the color of that groundwater. It's dark, and the fumes from that soil, you couldn't stand there. We had to wear our half-mast thing with filters to try and work around that area. This was back in 2003. 2003, when we started looking at some of these sites, the issue here was groundwater and soil removal, and the building was still here, but we were addressing that site. This is groundwater where we thought the contamination initially was, and after we started, working on the area, this is the lease right at the corner. This is where we started addressing. We just dug up the whole contaminated soil. that was the best thing for us, because if you don't get it at the source, this stuff gets in the groundwater and you're going to have issues with this. So we think that the size of the plume right now, or as of 2009, this is what it looks like compared to that. So we're still working on the site. Tuba City, former Davis Chevrolet, just to show you that gasoline gets in the groundwater. 20 years later, it still floats on top of the groundwater. This one is Bon and Bon. White Eagle's up the street here, but 35 years later, you still have that product floating right on top of groundwater. This is Chinle. I was talking about that fuel release in 2005, 10,000 gallon release. This is pure gasoline. This is in, what was the date on this?
There was no date.
No date on that.
Oh, it's right there on his face.
2008.
It's right there
Where?
on his face.
Right there on the side.
Okay, well, I can't see
By his
that.
face, right by his face.
Oh, right here, 2000, yeah, 2008, yeah. 2008, 3 years after the release had occurred, we went and we had them complete some monitoring wells, and we start pulling on this thing. The whole, down from where we drilled to 30 feet, this whole column, maybe up to 15 feet, was this column of gasoline. So you can actually put this right into your tank if you want. So this is one of very, very complicated area. All different kind of operators, all different kind of releases that occurred even prior to 2005. Old tanks, new tanks, releases like this. So I just want to show just the amount of money that's involved. Since 2004, we spent a little over $16 million. US EPA contributed about 2.2, but most of that is probably try to keep the program alive. But you can see we had this big money at the beginning, 1.3 that we had, and then it kind of leveled off to about $400,000 a year. And then EPA hardly gave us anything till we started hollering in 2007. You know, they finally gave us some money, about $300,000, and then it dropped now. Since 2014, within 7 years, they just dropped all the funding. And we finally had $100,000, like I said, this year, but that was pounding the table and saying, you know, if you're the person that's going to be cracking a whip over us, you know, at least help us out with trying to address some of these things. But we don't have, every time we sit down with the operators and insurance companies, US EPA is out at the table because they don't have AST regulations, above ground regulations. They don't deal with it. So, but the way that we got the 100,000 was to tell them we need to make sure that we're concerned about the immediate threat to the health and of people in this area. So this is Chinle. Here's the site that we're talking about. This is the high school now, the high school, and people, the apartments and things like that over here surrounding here. There's the restaurant, and this stuff is sitting in this area. We haven't really stepped out this far to see where that gasoline went to, but we did initially pump some of that gasoline out, so that was our concern. Again, these are we pulled since then 325 tanks from 2001 to 2015. We evaluated over 209 sites, so we've issued no further actions at 124 sites. So we released it back to Navajo Nation. I think, again, like I said, we need some enforcement actions. That's it. So.